The rain fell not in drops, but in sheets. A solid, gray curtain that connected the bruised sky to the drowning earth. It was a merciless, cleansing rain, the kind that promised to wash away sins and tracks with equal indifference. For the girl, who now called herself June, it was both a blessing and a curse. A blessing because the water hammered her scent and her path into the thick gumbo mud, turning the vast prairie into a featureless, treacherous sea that no posse would willingly track through. A curse because every cold, heavy drop sapped the last dregs of warmth from her bones, turning her thin calico dress into a leaden shroud that clung to her limbs and dragged her down. She ran, or rather, she stumbled, a desperate, lurching gait that was more falling forward than running. Her lungs were twin fires in her chest, each breath a ragged tear of cold, wet air. Her bare feet, long since stripped of their flimsy shoes by the sucking mud, were numb and bleeding, protesting each step against the unseen stones and sharp grasses hidden beneath the slurry. In one arm, she clutched a small, sodden bundle of cloth, not a bag, but a piece of an old shirt tied at the corners. It held everything she owned in the world, a sliver of soap, a half-eaten biscuit wrapped in wax paper that was now surely ruined, and a small, smooth river stone her mother had given her years ago. It felt impossibly heavy. The world had shrunk to the next step, and the one after that, the horizon was gone, erased by the downpour. The sky was gone. The only reality was the burn in her muscles, the frantic, terrified beat of her heart against her ribs, and the ceaseless, drumming roar of the rain in her ears. It was a sound that had been her only companion for hours, a sound so constant it had become a form of silence. In that silence, the voices echoed. Halter's voice, thick with whiskey and false charm, the laughter of the men at the saloon, coarse and predatory. Her own voice, a small, choked sound of refusal. Fear was a sharper spur than exhaustion. It kept her moving long after her body had begged to surrender. She couldn't go back. To go back was to lose the one thing she still owned, the quiet, untouched core of herself she had guarded so fiercely. They thought they could buy it, own it, take it as their due for a roof and a few scraps of food. They had been wrong, but their being wrong wouldn't stop them from coming after her. Halter was not a man who took no for an answer. He saw defiance as an insult to his very existence, and he would hunt her down just to prove the world bent to his will. Her vision began to swim, the gray landscape blurring at the edges. A wave of dizziness washed over her, and she staggered, her knees buckling. She caught herself on the trunk of a lone, skeletal cottonwood, its bare branches clawing at the sky like a drowning man's hands, pressing her forehead against the rough, wet bark. She allowed herself a single, shuddering sob. It was a luxury she couldn't afford. Tears were just more water, and she was already drowning in it.
"Just a little farther,"
she whispered to herself, the words lost in the storm. Just to the next rise. But there were no rises, just an endless, flat expanse of misery. She pushed off from the tree, her legs trembling violently, and then she saw it. At first, it was just a distortion in the gray curtain, a flicker so faint she thought her tired eyes were playing tricks on her. She blinked, wiping the rain from her lashes with a numb hand. It was still there, a tiny, hazy speck of yellow light, warm and impossibly distant. It was a lamp. A lamp meant a house meant people, shelter. It could mean danger, another halter, another trap. But at this point, the certain death of the storm was a greater threat than the possible danger of a stranger. Hope, thin and fragile as it was, surged through her. It gave her a new, desperate strength. She fixed her eyes on the light and forced her legs into motion. It became her entire world, that small, golden promise. She didn't dare look away, terrified it would vanish. The ground sloped gently, and she slid more than walked down a shallow embankment, landing in water that surged past her ankles. A creek, swollen and angry. barred her path. For a moment, despair threatened to swallow her whole. But the light was on the other side. It seemed brighter now, closer. Gritting her teeth, she waded in. The current was strong, cold as ice, and it pulled at her dress, trying to drag her under. The water rose to her knees, then her waist. She held the cloth bundle high above her head, her teeth chattering so hard she thought they would break. She lost her footing on a slick rock, went under for a terrifying second, and came up sputtering, water filling her nose and mouth. But her feet found purchase again. She clawed her way up the opposite bank, gasping, her body a single, agonizing ache. She was closer now. The light was emanating from a barn, its large, weathered shape a dark silhouette against the storm. Next to it stood a small, sturdy-looking cabin, a thin curl of smoke rising from its stone chimney, immediately torn to shreds by the wind. A ranch. It was small, isolated, and looked as weary and enduring as the land itself. There were no sounds but the wind and the rain. No dogs barking, no voices. Just a quiet, lonely homestead hunkered down against the fury of the sky. She crept forward, using a line of rickety fencing for support. The barn door was open just a crack, wide enough for that sliver of lamplight to escape and slice through the gloom. It was a beckoning finger of warmth, peering through the gap. She saw the source of the light, a lantern, hanging from a rusty nail on a post, cast a pool of golden, dancing light over a small section of the barn's interior. The air inside smelled of hay, horse, and damp earth. It was the smell of safety. Within that circle of light, a man was working. He was brushing down a large, dark horse, his movements slow, steady, and methodical. He was tall, his frame lean but powerful under a worn flannel shirt. A wide-brimmed hat, stained with sweat and rain, shadowed his face, but she could see the line of a square jaw and a thick, dark mustache. He didn't speak to the horse, didn't hum or whistle. He just worked, his attention focused entirely on the animal, his hands moving over its flank with a practiced, gentle sureness. There was a profound quietness about him, a stillness that seemed to absorb the chaos of the storm outside. He moved like a man who was comfortable in his own silence, who didn't need to fill the world with noise. This was Jedediah Jed Knox, though she didn't know his name. He was a man carved from the land itself, weathered by the sun and hardened by the winters. His silence was not one of emptiness, but of depth. He had seen enough of the world's clamor to value its absence. His ranch was his sanctuary, a small patch of earth where he could impose a quiet order on a chaotic world. His horse, a powerful Mustang named Shadow, was more his partner than his property, and the evening ritual of grooming him was as much for Jed's own peace of mind as it was for the animal's comfort. June watched him for a long moment, her breath held tight in her chest. He wasn't like Halter. He didn't have the restless, predatory energy of the men in the saloon. He seemed rooted, calm, as much a part of the barn as the wooden beams above his head. But he was still a man, and men were a risk. She hesitated, her hand trembling on the rough wood of the door. The wind howled, driving a fresh onslaught of rain against her back. And the decision was made for her. She couldn't stay out here. She would die. Taking a shallow, shaky breath, she pushed the door open a little wider. It groaned in protest, a loud, grating sound that cut through the rhythm of the brushing. The man stopped. He didn't jump or turn quickly. His hands simply went still on the horse's back. For a long second, he didn't move at all. Then, slowly, he turned his head. His face was still mostly in shadow, but she could feel the weight of his gaze. It wasn't angry or surprised. It was just watchful. The horse shifted its weight, its large, dark eye fixing on her. June tried to speak, to explain, to plead, but the words were frozen in her throat. Her entire body had begun to shake uncontrollably, a violent tremor that was part cold, part terror and part sheer, overwhelming relief at having finally stopped running. She took a step forward, into the halo of the lantern light. She knew what he must see, a half-drowned creature, her hair plastered to her skull, her dress torn and covered in mud, her face pale and gaunt. A ghost washed up by the storm. She took another step, her legs feeling like they were made of wet sand. The ground just inside the barn was a churned-up mixture of mud and straw. Her numb foot caught on an uneven patch of ground. Her ankle twisted. With a small, defeated cry, her legs finally gave out. The world tilted, the golden light of the lantern spinning into a blur. She fell, not with a hard thud, but with a soft, final collapse. Her hands coming to rest in the cold, wet mud at the man's feet. She lay there, for a moment, unable to move. The fight utterly gone from her. She could feel the cold ooze seeping through the thin fabric of her dress, but she didn't have the strength to care. She pushed herself up just enough to rest on her elbows, lifting her head to look at the silent figure looming over her. The shadow of his hat still hid his eyes, but she could feel them on her, steady and unreadable. All the pretty speeches she might have rehearsed, all the lies or half-truths she could have spun, they all dissolved, leaving only the raw, desperate truth. Her voice, when it finally came, was a ragged, trembling whisper, barely audible over the drumming of the rain on the roof. "I've nowhere left to go." Jed Knox did not move for a full 3 heartbeats. He stood like a statue carved from rock and shadow, the lantern light catching the hard line of his jaw. He'd seen men collapse from drink, from fights, from the sheer weariness of the trail. He'd never seen anything quite like this. The girl was a piece of the storm itself, washed up and broken at his feet. Her words, though barely a whisper, hung in the air with the weight of a final, desperate prayer. Nowhere left to go. In this land, those were the most dangerous words a person could utter. They could invite predators, or they could, on rare occasions, find mercy. He didn't offer words. Words were cheap, easily broken things. He offered action. He took a single step forward, his worn leather boots making a soft squelch in the mud. He crouched down, not so low as to be on her level, but enough to close the distance. He extended a hand. It was a large hand, calloused and scarred from rope and wood and iron, the nails trimmed short and clean. It was an offer, plain and simple, with no conditions attached. June flinched. Her first instinct a jolt of pure, animal terror. A man's hand reaching for her in the dark had only ever meant one thing, but this was different. It wasn't grabbing or groping. It was just there, open, waiting, her eyes wide and dark with exhaustion, lifted from the hand to his face. For the first time, she could see him more clearly. His face was shadowed by his hat, but the lantern light from below illuminated features carved by a hard life. There were lines around his eyes, not from laughter, but from squinting into the sun and the wind. His expression was unreadable, a mask of stoic neutrality. He wasn't smiling, but he wasn't frowning either. He was simply waiting for her to make a choice. Slowly, hesitantly, she lifted her own hand. It was trembling, pale, and caked with mud. When her fingers touched his skin was surprisingly warm against her icy flesh. His grip was firm, enveloping her small hand completely. There was no gentleness in it, not in the soft, coddling sense. It was a grip of pure, practical strength, the kind a man uses to pull a calf from a ditch. He pulled, and she found the strength to get her feet under her. Rising unsteadily from the mud, she swayed, a wave of blackness threatening to pull her down again. Without a word, he shifted his grip to her upper arm, his fingers a solid band of support. He turned and led her out of the circle of light, deeper into the vast, fragrant darkness of the barn. He stopped before a stall, unlatched the wooden gate, and guided her inside. The air was thick with the warm, sweet smell of fresh hay. An old mare, her coat the color of winter moonlight, snorted softly from the corner, watching them with a curious, placid eye. Jed released her arm. He moved to a wooden peg on the wall and took down a heavy coat. It was made of thick, oiled canvas, the color of dusty earth, with a worn sheepskin collar. It looked like it had weathered 100 storms just like this one. He held it out to her. She just stood there, shivering, the rain and mud from her dress pooling around her feet on the clean straw. He made a small, impatient gesture. Understanding dawned. Her fingers were stiff and clumsy as she fumbled with the buttons of her sodden dress. It was a useless garment now, ruined beyond repair. She let it fall to the straw, leaving her in a thin, damp chemise that offered no modesty and less warmth. She reached for the coat, and Jed turned his back to her, a deliberate, calculated gesture of respect that struck her more powerfully than any kind word could have. He gave her the privacy of his back, his attention seemingly fixed on the rain lashing against the barn siding. She pulled the massive coat on. It was like wrapping herself in a shelter. It fell to her ankles, the sleeves completely swallowing her hands. It smelled of him of leather, wood smoke, and the clean scent of the rain-washed prairie. The sheer weight of it was grounding, a heavy, solid comfort against her trembling frame. She wrapped it tight, the sheepskin collar soft against her cheek. When he turned back, his gaze was level and impersonal. He picked up the lantern, and the shadows danced and leaped around them. "Come," he said. It was the first word he'd spoken to her, his voice a low, rough baritone, like stones grinding in a riverbed. He led her out of the barn and into the maelstrom again. Though the distance to the cabin was short, the wind tore at them, trying to rip the coat from her, but she held it fast. He pushed open the heavy wooden door of the cabin, and a wave of warmth washed over them. He stood aside to let her enter, then followed, closing the door and dropping a thick wooden bar into place. The roar of the storm was instantly muted, reduced to a distant, angry drumming. The inside of the cabin was one room, clean and spare. A stone hearth dominated one wall, a healthy fire blazing within it, its flames casting a warm, flickering glow on the log walls. A simple pine table with 2 chairs stood in the center. In one corner was a bed, neatly made, with a thick quilt folded at its foot. In the other corner, near the hearth, was a simple cot. There were no pictures on the walls, no curtains on the single window, no clutter. Everything had its place. It was the home of a man who lived a life stripped down to its essentials. June stood dripping on the stone floor just inside the door, feeling like a stray animal brought in from the cold, unsure of where she was allowed to be. She clutched the coat around herself, the warmth from the fire starting to work its way into her chilled bones, making her shiver even more violently. Jed moved past her without a glance. He set the lantern on the table and went to the hearth, adding another log to the fire from a neat stack beside it. Sparks flew up the chimney. Then he took a tin cup from a hook on the wall, dipped it into a wooden water bucket, and walked back to her. He held it out. She took it with both hands, her fingers too numb to hold it steady with just one. The metal was cool against her lips. She drank, the water clean and cold, the most wonderful thing she had ever tasted. She drained the cup and looked up at him, her throat working. "Thank you," she whispered. Could I have a blanket?" He gave a single, curt nod. He took the cup from her, placed it on the table, and walked over to the main bed. He picked up the heavy quilt, a patchwork of dark blues and greens, and brought it to her. He didn't ask her where she would sleep. He didn't ask her name or where she came from or who she was running from. The questions hung in the air, unspoken, and for now, unasked. He simply saw her need and met it. He held the quilt out. She reached for it, but her hands were still shaking too badly. Seeing her struggle, he took a step closer. For a terrifying moment, she thought he was going to touch her, to wrap it around her. She squeezed her eyes shut, a lifetime of fear conditioning her for an unwanted advance. But it never came. Instead, she felt the weight of the quilt being draped gently over her shoulders, on top of the heavy coat. It was an entirely impersonal gesture, like putting a blanket over a horse. He took care not to let his fingers brush against her skin. He then pointed a thumb toward the cot by the fire. "There," he said. It was a dismissal and an offering, all in one. He turned and walked to the far side of the small cabin, to the table. He pulled out one of the chairs, the one that faced the fire, but also put his back to her corner. He sat down, his large frame seeming to fill the small space. He took off his hat, placing it on the table, and ran a hand through his damp, dark hair. Then he leaned forward, resting his forearms on his knees, and stared into the flames. He was giving her space. He was giving her silence. He was offering her the one thing no one else had the freedom to be left alone. June slowly made her way to the cot. It was little more than a wooden frame with a thin mattress stuffed with what felt like corn husks. But it was dry, and it was near the fire. She didn't take off the coat. She couldn't bear to part with its protective weight. She lay down on her side, pulling the quilt up to her chin and curling into a tight ball. The firelight flickered on the opposite wall. She could see his silhouette, a solid, unmoving shape against the blaze. He didn't look at her. He didn't move. He just sat, a silent guardian in the dim light. The warmth, the silence, the sheer, bone-deep exhaustion finally overwhelmed the terror. For the first time in what felt like a lifetime, the voices in her head grew quiet. The fear receded, pushed back by the simple, profound kindness of a man who asked for nothing. Her eyelids grew heavy. The last thing she was aware of was the steady crackle of the fire and the drumming of the rain. A lullaby of survival. She woke to a world of gray light and silence. The storm had passed. The fire in the hearth had been banked to a bed of glowing, orange coals that still gave off a gentle heat. For a moment, she didn't know where she was. Then it all came flooding back: the rain, the chase, the barn, the silent man. She sat up abruptly, her heart pounding. The cabin was empty. The chair by the hearth was vacant. The man, Jed, was gone. Panic flared in her chest. Had he left her? Had he gone for the sheriff? But then she noticed the small details. A tin pot of coffee was sitting on the hearthstones, still warm. The wooden bar was lifted from the door. He hadn't abandoned her. He had simply started his day. He had let her sleep. A strange feeling washed over her. It wasn't gratitude. Not yet. It was something quieter, more tentative. It was a sense of equilibrium. He had offered shelter. She, in turn, felt a deep, instinctual need to not be a burden. It was the unspoken code of the frontier: you earn your place. You contribute. She slipped off the cot. The heavy coat fell away, and she stood in her still damp chemise. The air was cool, but not cold. She looked around the small cabin, her eyes taking in the sparse but orderly space. There was the tin cup she had used, sitting on the table next to his, a plate with a few biscuit crumbs, his hat. She moved with a quiet purpose that she hadn't felt in months. First, she took the heavy quilt, folded it as neatly as she could, and placed it back at the foot of the main bed, smoothing it down with her hands. Then she took the coat. She held it for a moment, the scent of him clinging to the fabric, before hanging it back on its peg by the door. At the table, she gathered the cup and plate. By the hearth was a small dry sink with a bucket of clean water and another for waste. She washed them carefully, using a rough cloth and a sliver of lye soap, and set them to dry. Her movements were slow, deliberate. This was a language she understood. This was how you said thank you without words. Her eyes scanned the room, looking for what else could be done. She saw a small sack of rice leaning against the wall, next to a sack of flour and another of beans. It was a simple act, but it felt important. She found a small pot, measured out a scoop of rice, and took it to the dry sink. She rinsed it, the feel of the hard grains running through her fingers a familiar, calming sensation. She added water from the bucket and placed the pot on the hearthstones, pushing it close to the glowing coals where it would slowly heat. Finally, she went to the fire. The embers were still hot. She found the kindling box and added a few small slivers of wood, gently blowing on the coals until a tiny flame flickered to life. She carefully added larger pieces, coaxing the fire back from a whisper to a steady, confident flame that began to warm the cabin once more. She stepped back, surveying her work. The blanket was folded, the kitchen was clean, rice was cooking, and the fire was burning bright. They were small things, insignificant in the grand scheme of things. But here, in the quiet morning light of this stranger's cabin, it felt like a beginning. It was her first act, not of survival, but of living. She walked to the single window and looked out. The world was washed clean. The sky was a soft, pale gray, and the prairie steamed in the cool air. In the distance, near a long stretch of broken fence line, she could see him, a solitary figure, axe in hand, methodically working his way down the line, splitting new posts and setting them in the damp earth. He was already at work, restoring the order that the storm had tried to undo. And inside, in the warmth of his cabin, she was doing the same. A silent bargain had been struck in the heart of the storm, a partnership born not of words, but of mutual, unspoken understanding. He provided the shelter, she would provide the hearth. The new day dawned on a world scoured clean. When Jed returned to the cabin, his boots heavy with mud and his hands raw from handling the axe, he found the fire rebuilt and a pot of rice steaming gently by the hearth. He stopped just inside the door, his eyes taking in the small, ordered space. The girl June, she had called herself, stood by the window, a small, still figure wrapped in one of his old, oversized flannel shirts that he had left on a chair for her. It was far too large, hanging off her narrow shoulders and falling to her knees like a dress. He saw the empty cot, the neatly folded quilt on his own bed. He said nothing. He didn't need to. Her actions spoke a language he understood far better than words. They spoke of a need to earn one's keep, to not be a debt. He simply gave a short, almost imperceptible nod in her direction, an acknowledgement that he had seen and understood. He hung his hat on its peg, washed his hands and face in the basin, and then sat at the table. June moved from the window, her bare feet silent on the wooden floorboards. She took a wooden bowl from the shelf, filled it with rice, and placed it in front of him. She did the same for herself and sat opposite him. The silence in the cabin was thick and heavy, broken only by the scrape of their spoons against the bowls and the soft crackle of the fire. June ate with her head bowed, her eyes fixed on her food. She was acutely aware of him, of his presence filling the small room. He ate with the slow, steady rhythm of a man who wasted no motion and no thought. He was not looking at her, his gaze directed towards the hearth, but she felt seen all the same. It was a new and unsettling feeling. In the saloon, being seen had been a threat, a prelude to a demand. Here, his quiet observation felt different. It was not predatory. It was assessing. He was weighing her, measuring her, not in the way a buyer measures livestock, but in the way a man measures a patch of land before deciding to plant. When they finished, she rose to take the bowls, but he was already on his feet. He took them from her hands, his fingers brushing hers for a fraction of a second. A jolt, like static electricity, shot up her arm. She pulled her hand back as if burned. He gave no sign that he had noticed, turning to wash the bowls himself. "Wood's low," he stated, his back to her. It wasn't a command, but it was an invitation to purpose. "I'm splitting logs out back." "I can help," she said quickly, her voice a little too loud in the quiet room. "I can stack." He glanced over his shoulder, his eyes unreadable. "All right." Outside, the air was crisp and clean, smelling of wet earth and pine. The woodpile was a chaotic jumble of logs and branches, a testament to the storm's fury. Jed picked up a heavy splitting maul, its head gleaming dully in the gray light. He moved with an economy of motion that was almost beautiful to watch. He'd select a round of wood, set it on the large chopping block, heft the maul, and bring it down with a single, perfect motion. The wood exploded apart with a satisfying thwack, 2 clean halves falling to the ground. He didn't grunt or strain. The tool seemed an extension of his own body. June's job was simple. She was to gather the split pieces and carry them to the sheltered lean-to against the side of the cabin, stacking them in neat rows. It was good work, honest work. It warmed her blood and quieted the frantic scurrying of her thoughts. For the first time in days, her mind was focused on something other than running. It was focused on the weight of the wood, the prickle of the bark against her skin, the simple geometry of a well-made stack. She worked in a rhythm with him, the thwack of the maul, followed by the soft thud of the pieces hitting the ground, her own quiet footsteps as she gathered them, the scrape of wood on wood as she added to the pile. They worked for nearly an hour, the silence between them companionable, a shared language of labor. The pile of split logs grew, and the stack in the lean-to rose steadily. She reached for a particularly large piece of split pine, its sharp, clean scent filling her nostrils. It was wedged under another log, and she had to stretch, reaching up high with her right arm to pull it free. As she did, the loose, wide sleeve of the flannel shirt slid down her arm, past her elbow, exposing the pale skin of her bicep and the scar that lay beneath. It was not a scar from an accident. It was a long, ugly discoloration, a map of old pain that started just below her shoulder and stretched halfway to her elbow. It was the color of a dying plum, mottled with shades of angry purple and sickly yellow-green. It was the distinct, unmistakable shape of a man's hand, the ghostly imprint of 4 fingers and a thumb that had gripped her with brutal, punishing force. A brand of ownership she had fought so desperately to escape. She felt the cool air on her skin a second before she realized the sleeve had fallen. Her breath hitched in her throat. Her movements, once fluid, became a clumsy, frantic scramble. She dropped the piece of wood and her hand flew to her arm, pulling the sleeve down, hiding the mark, hiding the shame. Her face burned, a hot flush of humiliation that was more painful than the bruise itself. She felt naked, exposed, her secret history laid bare for him to see. She risked a glance at him, her heart hammering against her ribs. Jed had stopped. The maul was resting on the chopping block, his hand still on the handle. He wasn't looking at her arm anymore. He was looking at her face. His expression hadn't changed. His features were still carved from impassive stone, but something in his eyes had hardened. They were like chips of flint, cold and sharp. The air, which had been filled with the rhythm of their work, was now utterly still. The silence was deafening. He had seen it. He knew. She braced herself for the question. Who did that to you? The question that would force her to give voice to the ugliness, to relive the moment Halter had grabbed her, his whiskey-sour breath on her face, his voice a low growl, promising what he would do to her for her defiance. She waited for the pity, the judgment, the look that would label her as damaged goods. But the question never came. Jed's gaze held hers for a long, unblinking moment. Then, he deliberately looked away. He took his hand from the maul and turned. Without a word, he picked up the armful of wood that lay at his feet, the pieces he had just split. He turned his back on her completely and walked to the lean-to, placing the wood carefully onto the stack. He did not look back. He simply walked past the wood pile, around the side of the cabin, and out of sight. June stood frozen, her hand still clutching her arm, her entire body trembling. He had left. He had seen her mark of shame and walked away. A cold dread, colder than any rain, seeped into her bones. He was going to tell her to leave. He knew she was trouble, tainted. She was a stray who had brought the dirt of the world into his clean, quiet life. But then she heard the sound of his footsteps on the porch, the creak of the cabin door opening and closing. He hadn't gone far. He had just gone inside. He had left her alone with her shame. And in that moment, she realized it wasn't an act of rejection. It was an act of profound, unspoken kindness. He had seen her vulnerability, her terror, and instead of prying it open with questions, he had shielded it with his absence. He had given her the one thing she needed most in that moment, the space to put herself back together without a witness. Slowly, the trembling subsided. She took a deep, shuddering breath of the cold, clean air. She finished stacking the wood she had dropped, her movements careful and deliberate. When she finally went back inside, she found him sitting at the table, sharpening a knife with a whetstone. The rhythmic shing, shing, shing of steel on the stone, the only sound in the room. He didn't look up when she entered. He acted as if nothing had happened. He had seen her deepest scar, and he had chosen to pretend he was blind. The rest of the day passed in that same, charged silence. The evening meal was a simple stew of venison and potatoes he had cooked. The smell filled the small cabin, a comforting, domestic aroma that was at war with the tension coiling in June's stomach. She knew the silence couldn't last. The secret was between them now, a living thing in the small space. To leave it unspoken was to let it fester. She had to give it air, or it would suffocate them both. She waited until they had finished eating. The firelight danced on the log walls, casting long shadows. Jed was cleaning his knife, his attention focused on the task. Her own hands were clenched into fists in her lap, her knuckles white. She had to force the words out, her voice small and tight. "I've never been kissed." The sound of the whetstone stopped. He set the knife and the stone down on the table, very carefully. He still didn't look at her, but his whole body was listening. She swallowed hard and pushed on, the words coming out in a rush, as if to keep them from being pulled back down her throat. "Never let a man touch me. I was keeping it for a home, for a husband, for a life that was clean." She finally looked up, her eyes pleading with him to understand. "But I don't have a home to keep it in anymore. It feels like it's just a thing, waiting in the dark to be taken." "It doesn't have walls around it now." Her confession hung in the air, fragile and raw. She was talking about more than a kiss. She was talking about her very self, the untouched core of her being that she felt was now unprotected, adrift in a world of men like Halter. She was explaining the bruise without ever mentioning it. Jed was silent for a long time. He picked up the knife, but he didn't sharpen it. He just held it, his thumb resting on the flat of the blade. He seemed to be weighing her words as carefully as he would weigh a pouch of gold dust. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and steady, as solid as the stone of the hearth. He looked directly at her, his gaze clear and unwavering. "Home isn't a place for safekeeping," he said, his words simple, but carrying the weight of a profound truth. He paused, letting the statement settle. "It's a place where you get to choose what you keep." The words struck her with the force of a physical blow. She stared at him, his meaning slowly dawning on her. He wasn't offering her pity. He was offering her strength. He was taking her greatest fear, her lack of a physical shelter, and turning it on its head. He was telling her that protection didn't come from four walls and a roof. It came from within. The choice was not the world's to make. It was hers. She was the home. She was the walls. She was the keeper of her own self. A single tear, hot and heavy, escaped her eye and traced a clean path through the grime on her cheek. It wasn't a tear of sadness or fear. It was a tear of release. For the first time, someone had looked at her, seen the damage, and had not seen something broken. They had seen something that still had the power to choose. Jed said nothing more. He stood up, took the bowls to the basin, and then went to tend the fire, his movements as steady and deliberate as always. But the silence in the cabin had changed, fundamentally and forever. It was no longer heavy with unspoken secrets. It was light, filled with a shared, quiet understanding, a foundation, stronger than any stone, had just been laid in the heart of that little cabin. 3 days passed. They fell into a rhythm dictated by the sun and the needs of the land. It was a life of quiet labor, a world shrunk to the boundaries of Jed's property line. For June, each moment was a revelation. She learned the specific heft of the water bucket, the grainy texture of horse feed, the way the morning light first touched the easternmost fence post. She learned the sounds of the cabin, the groan of the floorboard by the hearth, the whisper of the wind under the eaves, the soft sigh the fire made as it died to embers in the night. These small, solid certainties began to build a fragile wall around the chaos of her memories. The panic that had been her constant companion began to recede, leaving behind a dull ache of caution. She never spoke of her past, and Jed never asked. He provided the space, and she began, cautiously, to inhabit it. He had given her a pair of his old work trousers, which she had painstakingly altered. Cutting them off and sewing the hems with a needle and thread she found in a small wooden box. With the oversized shirt, she had a uniform of sorts, the clothing of a person who worked, not a girl who was displayed. The bruise on her arm faded from a violent purple to a mottled, sallow green, a ghost of the hand that had held her. Each time she saw it, she was reminded of Jed's words, "It's a place where you get to choose what you keep." She was choosing. She chose to focus on the warmth of the fire, the taste of fresh coffee, the steady, grounding presence of the silent man who shared his home with her. She was beginning to believe, in a small, tentative corner of her heart, that she might have finally outrun the past. It was late afternoon on the 4th day when the sound came. June was on the porch, mending a tear in one of Jed's shirts, her fingers slowly growing more nimble with the needle. The sun was a pale, watery disk in the sky, and a cool breeze rustled the dry prairie grass. Jed was in the barn, sharpening the blade of a plow. The only sounds were the wind and the distant, rhythmic scrape of metal on stone. Then, another sound intruded. It was faint at first, a low, rhythmic thudding that was not part of the land's natural music. She stilled, her head lifting, the needle poised in midair. Her entire body became an instrument of listening. The sound grew stronger, more defined. It was the sound of a horse, moving at a steady trot. But it wasn't Jed's horse. Shadow. Who was in the corral? This was a rider, coming from the east, from the direction of the town she had fled. A cold, familiar dread began to seep into her veins, instantly chilling the tentative warmth she had cultivated. The peace of the last few days evaporated like mist in a harsh wind. She looked toward the barn, but Jed had not emerged. The scraping sound had stopped. He had heard it too. Her first instinct was to run, to bolt from the porch and lose herself in the vast, empty prairie. But Jed's words echoed in her mind. You get to choose. Running was not a choice. It was a surrender. She stood up, her legs trembling, and slipped back inside the cabin, pressing herself against the rough wood of the wall next to the door. She peered through the narrow gap between the door and its frame, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. The rider came into view. He was a stranger, perched atop a lean, dusty-looking bay. He was a man who seemed to wear the grime of the trail like a second skin. His clothes were a mix of cheap finery and worn leather, a once fancy velvet vest, now stained and frayed, over a dirty shirt. A low-slung gun belt held a pistol that had seen better days. But it was his face that made June's breath catch in her throat. He had a narrow, rat-like face with a perpetual sneer etched around his thin lips, as if he was constantly smelling something foul. It was a face she recognized from the saloon. His name was Cobb, one of Halter's most loyal dogs, a man who did the dirty work his boss couldn't be bothered with. Cobb reined his horse in about 20 yards from the cabin, his beady eyes scanning the small homestead with a look of bored contempt. He saw the smoke curling from the chimney, the neatly stacked wood pile, the light saddle horse in the corral. His gaze swept over everything, missing nothing. The barn door creaked open, and Jed stepped out into the daylight. He moved without haste, wiping his hands on a rag he tucked into his waistband. He didn't have his gun belt on. His pistol was inside the cabin, on a peg by his bed. A fresh wave of fear washed over June. He was unarmed. Jed stopped on the edge of the porch. His body language relaxed, but his posture was that of a man ready for anything. He stood with his feet planted firmly, his arms loose at his sides. He was a mountain, solid and unmovable. He simply waited. Cobb spat a stream of tobacco juice into the dirt. "Howdy," he called out, his voice a lazy drawl that dripped with false friendliness. "Looking for someone." Jed didn't reply immediately. He let the silence stretch, forcing the other man to continue. "Name's Greg Halter," Cobb said, dropping the name as if it were a royal title. "Runs the saloon over in dusty little Redemption. Maybe you heard of him." "I keep to myself," Jed said, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. It was like a stone dropping into a deep well. Cobb's sneer widened. "A man like Halter. He takes care of his property. Got a girl working for him. Young thing, pretty, but with a stubborn streak. Seems she got a fool notion in her head and lit out a few nights back. During that storm, we figure she came this way. Nowhere else to go, really." Inside the cabin, June squeezed her eyes shut. Property. The word struck her like a physical blow. That's all she was to them. A thing to be owned, used, and retrieved when it went missing. Her hand was pressed flat against the rough wood of the door, the splinters digging into her palm. She was shaking so hard she was afraid the door itself would rattle. "Haven't seen anyone." Jed said. The statement was final, absolute. There was no room for argument in it. Cobb chuckled, a dry, unpleasant sound. "Now, I ain't saying you're lying, but a man gets lonely out here. A pretty girl shows up in the rain. It could make a man forgetful." He leaned forward in his saddle, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial, greasy tone. "See, Halter's real particular about what's his. He invested in this girl, a real untouched prize, if you take my meaning. He was saving her for a special customer. Her running off like that. It's bad for business. He's offering a reward. $20, just for word of where she is. $20, the price of a decent horse, the price of her life." June felt sick. Jed's posture didn't change, but June, watching through the crack, saw a subtle shift. His shoulders seemed to broaden, his stillness becoming more dense, more dangerous. The air around him grew heavy, charged with a silent, lethal energy. "I told you," Jed said, his voice dropping an octave, the sound now holding a low rumble of warning, like distant thunder. "I haven't seen anyone. You're wasting your time here." For the first time, a flicker of uncertainty crossed Cobb's smug face. He was used to bullying and bluster. He wasn't used to this kind of absolute, immovable opposition. He looked at Jed, really looked at him, and seemed to finally see not just a quiet farmer, but something else. He saw the hardness in his eyes, the set of his jaw, the quiet confidence of a man who was not easily moved. Cobb's hand, which had been resting on his thigh, twitched, moving almost unconsciously closer to the butt of his pistol. And in that same instant, Jed's right hand moved. It didn't move fast, but it moved with a chilling, deliberate grace. It came to rest on the top of the worn, hickory handle of the splitting maul that was leaning against the porch rail. His fingers didn't grip it. They just lay there, a silent promise of what the tool could be used for. It was not a weapon of a gunslinger, but the tool of a working man. And in that context, it was somehow more menacing. June's breath caught in her throat. She could see Jed's knuckles, white as bone where they rested on the wood. She could see the cold, flat stillness in his eyes, a look that was far more terrifying than any open rage. It was the look of a man who had made a decision, a man who had drawn a line in the dirt with his soul. This porch, this cabin, this girl hiding behind the door. They were on his side of the line, and Cobb was on the other. The two men were locked in a silent battle of wills. The only sounds were the wind and the nervous stamping of Cobb's horse. Cobb's sneer had vanished, replaced by a tense, calculating look. He was reassessing the odds. A lonely homesteader was one thing, this man was another. He wasn't afraid, but he was a businessman. $20 wasn't worth getting his skull cracked open with a splitting maul by a man who looked like he knew exactly how to use it. Finally, Cobb broke the silence, forcing a laugh that sounded brittle and false. "All right, friend, no need to get touchy, just asking a question." He pulled on the reins, turning his horse in a tight circle, but he didn't leave immediately. He stopped and looked back, his sneer returning, this time filled with genuine malice. "You tell your wife or sister or whoever that little stray is you got hiding in there that Greg Halter doesn't forget," he snarled, his voice venomous. "He always collects what he's owed. This ain't over." His gaze flicked from Jed to the cabin door, and for a terrifying second, June felt as if he could see her right through the wood. "We'll be back," he promised, "and we won't be asking so politely next time." With a final, contemptuous spit into the dirt, he spurred his horse and galloped away, his form shrinking against the vast emptiness of the prairie until he was just a dark speck on the horizon. Jed didn't move until the speck had completely vanished. He remained standing by the porch rail, his hand resting on the maul, his gaze fixed on the point where Cobb had disappeared. The wind whipped a strand of dark hair across his forehead. The immediate danger had passed, but the threat remained, hanging in the air like the smell of smoke after a fire. Slowly, he took his hand off the maul. He turned, his face an unreadable mask, and looked at the cabin door. He knew she was there. He knew she had heard everything. June pushed herself away from the door, her legs so weak she had to lean against the wall for support. Her whole body was shaking with the aftermath of terror and a new, crushing wave of guilt. She had brought this to him. She had brought the ugliness of Halter's world to this quiet, peaceful place. She had put this good, silent man in danger. He opened the door and stepped inside. He didn't look at her at first. He walked across the room to the peg by his bed and took down his gun belt. The leather creaked as he buckled it around his hips, the weight of the Colt revolver settling naturally against his thigh. He checked the action of the pistol, his movements efficient and practiced. Only then did he look at her. His eyes were dark, his expression grim. She expected anger, recrimination. She expected him to tell her to leave, to take her trouble and go before it destroyed him too. "It's all right," he said, his voice low and rough. But it wasn't all right. She could see it in the way his hand now rested near the butt of his gun. She could see it in the way his gaze kept drifting to the window, to the empty horizon. The sanctuary was no longer safe. The walls he had built around his quiet life had been breached, and the men who rode after her had promised to return. Cobb's departure did not restore the peace. It shattered it, replacing the quiet solitude with a humming, watchful tension. The threat was no longer a vague memory June was running from. It now had a name and a face, and it had found her trail. The vast, empty prairie no longer felt like a sanctuary, but like an exposed stage, and they were the only actors on it, waiting for the audience to return. The sky seemed to agree. The brief respite of sun gave way to a persistent, dreary rain that settled over the land for days. It wasn't the violent, cleansing downpour of the storm that had brought her here, but a cold, steady drizzle that turned the ground into a deep, grasping mud and kept the world shrouded in a perpetual gray twilight. The rain hemmed them in, confining them to the small island of the cabin and the barn, forcing them into a proximity that was both a comfort and a constant reminder of the danger she had brought to his door. Jed never spoke of Cobb's visit, but his actions spoke for him. The gun belt was now a permanent part of his attire, the weight of the Colt a constant, silent presence at his hip. Before, he had moved with the easy rhythm of a man at peace with his land. Now, there was a new alertness in his posture. He spent more time watching the horizon, his gaze sweeping the empty expanse from the cabin window or the barn door, his expression as grim and gray as the weather. He was a man fortifying his territory, not against the elements, but against the encroachment of other men. June was consumed by a tidal wave of guilt. She was a debt he had never asked to incur, a danger he now had to face. She tried to tell him this one morning, as they sat in the quiet of the cabin. "You should make me leave," she whispered, her eyes fixed on the table. "It's not your fight." Jed didn't even look up from the harness buckle he was polishing. "I decide what's mine," he said, his voice flat. The words were not meant to be reassuring, but they were. They were a statement of fact, as solid and unchangeable as the stone hearth. He had made a choice. The conversation was over. If she could not leave, then she would work. She would make herself essential. She would weave herself into the fabric of this place so thoroughly that to remove her would be to unravel it. The routine of the ranch became her salvation. She rose before the sun, her body still aching with a deep weariness, but her mind clear with purpose. She learned to mix the feed for the horses, a precise measure of oats and corn, the smell of the dry grain, a clean, honest scent that filled her lungs. She learned to recognize the specific knicker shadow, Jed's powerful Mustang, made when he was hungry, and the soft, rumbling snort of the old mare, Daisy, when she was content. Jed was a silent teacher. He taught by doing, and he expected her to learn by watching. He showed her once how to clean a hoof, his large, scarred hands surprisingly gentle as he worked the pick around the frog of the horse's foot. The next day, he simply handed her the pick and watched, his arms crossed, his expression unreadable, as she hesitantly mimicked his actions. When she finished, he inspected her work with a critical eye, then gave a single, curt nod. It was the highest praise she had ever received. She learned to mend leather, her small, clumsy stitches gradually becoming neater and stronger as she repaired a set of worn reins. She learned to treat a rope burn on Daisy's leg, her hands steady as she applied the salve, the old horse trusting her with a placid, deep-eyed calm. The barn became her domain as much as the cabin. It was a place of honest smells, hay, leather, horse, and honest work. The rhythmic, repetitive tasks soothed the frantic fear in her mind, anchoring her in the present moment. One afternoon, Jed rode out to check his fences on the far side of the property, leaving her alone for the first time since Cobb's visit. Before he left, he simply said, "A neighbor's watching the boy. I'll bring him back before supper." June had not known there was a boy. The revelation startled her. This quiet, solitary man had another life, another responsibility she knew nothing about. She spent the afternoon in a state of nervous anticipation. When she heard the sound of 2 horses returning, she smoothed her hair and stood on the porch, her hands clenched in the folds of her trousers. Jed rode up on Shadow, leading a small, shaggy pony. On its back sat a small boy who couldn't have been more than 7 years old. He was a miniature version of Jed Solemn, with dark, watchful eyes and a head of unruly brown hair. He was dressed in patched overalls and a flannel shirt, his small, bare feet dangling high above the stirrups. He didn't smile or wave. He just watched her, his gaze as steady and assessing as Jed's. Jed dismounted and lifted the boy down from the pony. He set him on his feet and placed a hand on his shoulder. "June," he said, his voice carrying in the damp air. "This is Tom. He lives here." The introduction was as spare and functional as the man himself. The boy, Tom, just continued to stare at her. June knelt down so she was on his level.
"Hello, Tom?"
she said softly.
"I'm June."
Tom didn't reply. He simply looked from her to Jed and back again. He was a child of silence, clearly accustomed to a world with few words. Jed led the horses to the barn, leaving them alone on the porch. The silence stretched. June, feeling awkward, was about to stand up when Tom took a small step forward. He held out his hand, In his palm was a perfectly shaped bird's egg, a pale, delicate blue speckled with brown. It was a peace offering. She smiled, a genuine small smile, and gently touched the smooth surface with one finger. "It's beautiful," she said. Tom gave a single, solemn nod, as if a great matter of state had been settled, then curled his fingers around the egg and followed Jed to the barn. Tom's presence changed the dynamic of the cabin. He was a quiet, self-contained child, but he filled the silence with a different quality. It was no longer a heavy, adult silence, but a more natural, comfortable quiet. He had his own routines. He would spend hours by the creek, building intricate dams of mud and stone. He would sit by the fire in the evenings, carving small animals from scraps of wood with a little knife Jed had given him. He rarely spoke, but when he did, it was to ask a direct, practical question. "Is the coffee hot? Did you see the hawk?" He accepted June's presence with the same quiet stoicism with which he accepted the rain and the sun. She was simply a new part of his landscape. It was Tom who, in his own way, finally broke through the last of her defenses. The rain had finally stopped one afternoon, leaving the world washed and glittering. A pale sun was trying to break through the clouds, and the air was fresh and cool. June was sitting on the porch steps, patching one of Tom's overalls, when the boy came and sat beside her. He didn't speak, just watched her needle flash in and out of the rough denim. After a few minutes, he reached down, plucked a long, broad blade of grass, and began to fiddle with it. He held it between his two thumbs, creating a narrow gap, and then brought it to his lips. He blew. A loud, sharp, piercing whistle cut through the afternoon quiet. It was a surprisingly vibrant sound, full of life. June jumped, startled. Tom looked at her, a flicker of amusement in his solemn eyes. He held the blade of grass out to her. It was an invitation. She tried to imitate him, holding the grass taut between her thumbs. But when she blew, only a soft, breathy hiss came out. She tried again, adjusting the tension, but with the same result. Tom watched her efforts with the patience of a seasoned master. He took another blade of grass and, in slow motion, showed her exactly how to hold it, how to purse her lips. She tried again, and again. She became so focused on the simple, ridiculous task of making a blade of grass sing that she forgot everything else. She forgot Halter. She forgot Cobb. She forgot the fear that had been her constant shadow. There was only her and the boy, and this blade of grass. On the fifth try, as she blew, a pathetic little squeak emerged. It was such a funny, feeble sound, so earnest and so completely wrong. Tom let out a small snort of a laugh, and then something inside June broke loose. A bubble of pure, unadulterated amusement rose up in her chest, a feeling so foreign she barely recognized it. It came out of her mouth not as a giggle, but as a full, unrestrained laugh. It was a sound like rushing water, clear and bright and utterly free. The sound surprised her so much that she stopped, her hand flying to her mouth, her eyes wide. She had not laughed in years. She had forgotten the feeling of it, the way it shook her from the inside out. From the corner of her eye, she saw movement. Jed was standing by the barn door, a bridle in his hand. He had been watching them. He stood perfectly still, his face in shadow. But she saw it, a tiny, almost imperceptible twitch at the corner of his mouth. His lips, usually set in a firm, hard line, softened for just a fraction of a second. It wasn't a smile. It was the memory of a smile, a ghost of an expression on a face that had forgotten how to make it. But he had seen her laugh, and he had, in his own way, shared in it. The moment passed in an instant. He turned and disappeared back into the shadows of the barn. But the image was burned into June's mind. That evening, as the sun was setting, casting long, golden fingers of light across the wet prairie, June took a walk. The world was bursting with new life after the rain. She saw a small patch of Indian paintbrush, their fiery red tips a startling slash of color against the green. She knelt and picked a single, perfect stalk. She carried it back to the cabin, the velvety feel of the petals soft against her fingers. She didn't know why she had picked it, or what she would do with it. It was just a small, beautiful thing in a world that had been so ugly. She hesitated on the porch. Giving it to him felt too bold, too forward. It was a gesture that belonged to a different kind of life. So instead, she simply laid it on the worn wooden rail of the porch, right by the door where he would see it when he came in. It was a silent offering, a splash of color left on his doorstep. The next morning, the flower was gone. She felt a small pang of disappointment, assuming the wind had taken it in the night. She went about her morning chores, putting it out of her mind. It was later, when she was sweeping the cabin floor, that she saw it. Jed's ledger lay open on the small table he used as a desk. It was a simple, leather-bound book where he kept track of his accounts, the price of seed, the sale of a calf, the cost of nails. It was a book of hard facts and figures, the story of his survival written in numbers. And there, pressed carefully between a page listing the cost of winter feed and another detailing the need for new horseshoes, was the single stalk of Indian paintbrush. He had taken her small, beautiful offering and placed it in the very heart of his world, preserving it among the practical, essential facts of his life. The fragile piece born from a shared laugh and a pressed flower was as thin as a layer of morning ice. It could not bear weight. For a day or two, life continued its quiet rhythm. But the silence was now a different kind. It was the silence of listening, of waiting. Every gust of wind sounded like a distant rider, every snap of a twig in the fire like the cocking of a hammer. The world outside the cabin had become a threat, and the home they had started to build felt like a temporary fort, its walls made of nothing more than hope. The sky was the first to give warning. The soft, hazy blue of the late autumn sky began to curdle, thickening into a sheet of dirty steel that pressed down on the prairie. The air grew heavy and still, holding its breath. There was no rain. Not yet, but the light grew dim and strange, casting long, distorted shadows that seemed to claw at the edges of the homestead. It was Tom who heard it first. He was sitting on the porch, meticulously arranging a line of pebbles, when his head shot up, his small body going rigid. He looked out at the eastern horizon, his child's face suddenly old with a primal, animal alertness. June, who was bringing a bucket of water from the well, saw the look on his face and froze. "What is it? Tom?" she asked, her voice a low whisper. He didn't answer. He just pointed with a small, trembling finger. And then she heard it too. It was not the sound of a single horse this time. It was the heavy, rhythmic drumming of multiple hooves, a sound of purpose and power, eating up the distance with a grim, relentless cadence. It was the sound of a hunt reaching its conclusion. The cabin door opened and Jed stepped out. He didn't need to ask. He had heard it from inside. His face, which had in recent days shown faint traces of a softer life, was now set in hard, unforgiving lines. His eyes were chips of granite, cold and focused. His hand was already resting on the butt of his Colt. "Inside," he said. The word was not a request. It was an iron command. "Both of you." He herded them into the cabin and barred the door. The drumming of the hooves grew louder, a sound that vibrated up through the soles of their feet. June's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic, trapped bird. She grabbed Tom's small hand, his fingers cold and stiff in hers. Jed moved with a calm, terrifying efficiency. He crossed the room in 2 strides, his boots echoing on the wooden floorboards. He grabbed the corner of a large, bearskin rug near the hearth and threw it back, revealing a square, iron-ringed trapdoor. It was the entrance to the root cellar. "Get in," he said, pulling the ring. The door lifted with a groan, revealing a square of blackness that smelled of damp earth and potatoes. "Stay down," No matter what you hear, you do not make a sound. You do not come out. Understand?" June could only nod, her throat too tight for words. She pushed Tom gently toward the opening. The boy, his face pale but his eyes wide and trusting, scrambled down the short, steep ladder without a whimper. June followed, her body clumsy with fear. The last thing she saw before Jed closed the door was his face looking down at them, his expression grim, ancient, and utterly resolved. The door closed, plunging them into absolute darkness. The world was gone, replaced by the smell of dirt and the cold, damp air. June reached out, her hands finding Tom's small, shaking shoulders. She pulled him close, wrapping her arms around him, trying to shield him with her own body from the sounds she knew were coming. The thud of the trap door settling into place above them was a sound of finality. The cabin had become a tomb. Above them, they could hear Jed's footsteps, one set of boots, moving deliberately. He was blowing out the lamp. She realized he was choosing to fight in the dim, gray light from the window. Then, silence. A profound, waiting silence that was more terrifying than the approaching hoofbeats. The horses arrived. They could hear the jingle of harnesses, the creak of leather, the soft thud of hooves on the damp earth just outside the cabin walls. Then, a man's voice, loud and arrogant, laced with a cruel amusement. It was a voice June would hear in her nightmares for the rest of her life. "Knox, I know you're in there, and I know who you're hiding. I've come to collect my property." It was Halter. There was no answer from Jed. The silence from within the cabin was a challenge, a refusal. Halter's voice came again, closer this time, right outside the door. "Don't be a fool. I don't want to damage my investment, but I'll tear this shack down board by board to get to her. Send the girl out now. No one has to get hurt." Still, only silence from above. Tom was trembling in June's arms, his face buried in her shirt. She held him tighter, whispering words she didn't believe herself. "It's okay. It's okay. We're safe." "Last chance, farmer," Halter bellowed. The response was not a word, but an earth-shattering crash. The cabin door, the one Jed had so carefully reinforced, exploded inward, torn from its hinges in a shower of splintered wood. 3 sets of heavy boots stomped into the cabin. "Find her," Halter commanded. From their hiding place, June and Tom could see nothing, but they could hear everything. They heard the sounds of men overturning the table, throwing things from shelves. A plate shattered. "She ain't here, boss," a familiar, rat-like voice said. "Cobb." "Check the bed," Halter ordered. A moment later, a gunshot blasted through the cabin, a deafening explosion that made June cry out, muffling the sound against Tom's hair. It was followed instantly by a second shot. A man screamed, a high, thin sound of agony, followed by a heavy thud as a body hit the floor. "He's by the hearth," Cobb yelled. The fight devolved into a chaotic storm of noise. Gunshots, the crash of furniture, guttural yells of pain and rage. It sounded less like a fight between men and more like a struggle between large, savage animals in a cage. June could hear the heavy, desperate breathing, the sickening impact of fists on flesh. She pressed her hands over Tom's ears, though it was a useless gesture. The violence was so loud it seemed to seep through the very floorboards. A body slammed against the trapdoor right above their heads, making them both jump. Dust rained down on them. A man grunted in pain. "Get off me!" Then, a new sound, the sharp clang of metal on metal, followed by a choked-off cry. Suddenly, the frantic noise stopped. It was replaced by a single, terrifying sound, the ragged, labored breathing of one man. For a long, terrible moment, there was nothing else. The silence was worse than the fighting. Who was left standing? Was it Jed? June held her breath, her heart frozen in her chest, praying, pleading with a God she wasn't sure was listening. Heavy, deliberate footsteps approached the center of the room, stopping directly over the trapdoor. The bearskin rug was scraped aside. "Well, well," Halter's voice said, thick with triumph. "What do we have here?" A sliver of gray light appeared as the iron ring was lifted. The trapdoor was pulled open. June looked up into the face of Greg Halter. He was a big man, built like a bull, with a florid, clean-shaven face that was now flushed with exertion. A thin trickle of blood ran from a cut on his forehead, but his eyes were gleaming with a victorious, predatory light. Behind him, Cobb was leaning against the wall, clutching his arm, his face pale and twisted in pain. On the floor near the hearth lay the third man, still and silent in a growing pool of darkness. Halter's eyes found June in the gloom of the cellar. A slow, deeply unpleasant smile spread across his lips. "There you are, my dear," he said, his voice a low, possessive purr. "Did you really think you could hide from me?" He gestured with his gun. "Come on out. Your little adventure is over." June couldn't move. She was paralyzed by a fear so absolute it felt like being encased in ice. Halter's smile faded. His voice became hard as iron. "Now!" Slowly, her limbs feeling like lead. June released Tom. She looked at the boy. His face was a mask of terror, his big eyes staring up at the men. She put a finger to her lips, a silent plea for him to stay hidden, to stay quiet. She climbed the ladder, her movements stiff and robotic. As her head rose above the floorboards, she saw him. Jed was on the floor on the far side of the room, half conscious, his head slumped against the stone of the hearth. There was blood matting his dark hair, a dark stain spreading across his temple. His gun lay on the floor, just out of his reach. He had fought for her. He had fought like a cornered wolf, and he had lost. Cobb, his arm bleeding through his shirt, lurched forward and grabbed her arm, his fingers digging into the flesh of her bicep in the exact same spot as the old bruise. He hauled her the rest of the way out of the cellar, his grip merciless. He shoved her forward and she stumbled, falling to her knees on the floor of the ruined cabin. Just a few feet from where Jed lay, the air was thick with the smell of gunpowder, sweat, and spilled blood. Halter holstered his pistol and looked down at her, his expression one of supreme satisfaction. He nudged Jed with the toe of his boot. "You put up a good fight, farmer. A foolish one. All this, for a girl who isn't yours." He looked back at June, his eyes raking over her. "But she will be mine to do with as I please, and you've just made me very, very displeased." The world had shrunk to the size of the ruined cabin. The air was thick with the metallic tang of blood and the acrid bite of gunpowder, a foul perfume of violence. June remained on her knees, the rough, splintered floorboards digging into her skin. Halter's shadow fell over her, a black stain, and his presence seemed to suck all the air from the room. He was the center of this new, broken world, and his victory was absolute. "Cobb," Halter said, his voice casual, as if discussing the weather. "Take a look at our friend over there. Make sure he doesn't wake up with any heroic ideas." Cobb, clutching his bleeding arm, shuffled over to Jed. He nudged Jed's unconscious form with his boot, then gave him a solid kick to the ribs for good measure. Jed didn't so much as groan. He was completely limp, a broken doll by the hearth. The sight of it sent a fresh wave of despair through June, so profound it was nauseating. This was her fault. This man's goodness, his quiet strength, had been shattered because of her. Halter paid his fallen man no mind. His full, undivided attention was on June. He took a step closer, and she could smell the whiskey on his breath, the stale scent of the saloon clinging to him like a shroud. "Now then," he said, his voice a greasy caress, a sound that soiled the air it touched. "We have some business to conclude. You cost me a great deal of trouble, girl. More importantly, you cost me money, and you embarrassed me. I don't like being embarrassed." He crouched down, bringing his face level with hers. His eyes, small and porcine, roamed over her face, her body, with an expression of appraisal. as if she were a piece of livestock he was about to purchase. Paralysis was a physical thing, a shroud of ice that had settled over her limbs. She couldn't move, couldn't speak, could barely even breathe. "I had plans for you," he continued, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Big plans. You were going to make me a very wealthy man, but you chose to throw all that away. For what? For this, a dirt-floored shack and a silent farmer who couldn't even protect you." He reached out and grabbed a fistful of her hair, yanking her head back. Pain, sharp and searing, shot through her scalp. Tears sprang to her eyes, but she refused to make a sound. She would not give him the satisfaction. "I think," he murmured, his face so close she could see the broken veins in his cheeks, "that it's time you learned a lesson about property, about what happens when something of mine tries to run away." He let go of her hair and shoved her backward. She fell, her head hitting the wooden floor with a dull thud. Dazed, she looked up at him as he stood, a towering, monstrous silhouette against the gray light of the broken doorway. He reached into his coat and drew a knife. It was not a big one, but a thin, wicked-looking blade that glinted dully. It was a tool for details, not for a brawl, a tool of pure menace. He held it loosely, expertly, in his hand. He started to walk toward her, his boots heavy and deliberate on the floorboards. "You owe me," he said, the whisper gone, his voice now a low, guttural growl of pure possession. "You ran out on your debt. It's time to pay it back, to give me what was promised." He was 3 steps away. 2. The ice around her heart began to crack, not with a thaw, but with the pressure of a terror so immense it was about to shatter her into a million pieces. This was it. This was the end of everything, the end of the quiet core of herself she had guarded for so long. He was going to carve it out of her, right here, on the floor of the only place she had ever felt safe. Her gaze, wild with panic, darted around the room, looking for an escape that didn't exist. She saw the overturned table, the shattered plate, the dead man in the corner, and then she saw Jed. He hadn't moved. He was just a shape, a heap of discarded clothing and broken bones. The blood on his temple had traced a dark, crooked river down his cheek. He had stood between her and this. He had fought, for her. He had taken on 3 men, for her, and he had lost. Something shifted inside her, a tectonic plate deep in her soul ground into a new position. The wave of sheer, paralyzing terror receded, and in its place, something else rose. It was hot, fierce, and utterly foreign. It was rage, a pure, protective fury that had no room for fear. It was not for herself. It was for him, for the quiet man who had offered her a coat and a blanket and the silence she so desperately needed. For the man who had seen her scar and pretended he was blind. For the man who had preserved her small offering of a wildflower in the heart of his world. Halter had not just broken into a cabin. He had desecrated a sanctuary. He had not just beaten a man, he had hurt her man. And in that instant of pure, clarifying rage, her eyes found it. The gun. Jed's Colt. It lay on the floor, halfway between her and the hearth. It had been knocked from his hand during the fight. It lay there like a fallen king's scepter, dark and powerful, its wooden grip seeming to glow in the dim light. It was the only piece of him that was not broken. It was his strength, his will, lying there, waiting. Halter was almost upon her now, the knife held low, his ugly smile returning. He was savoring this moment, drawing out her terror like a fine wine. It was his mistake. With a strangled cry that was part sob, part roar, June lunged, not away from him, but sideways. She didn't run, she crawled, her hands and knees scraping on the rough floor, her entire being focused on that one single object. Halter grunted in surprise, his leisurely advance broken. "Get back here, you little cat," he snarled, taking a step to cut her off. But she was faster. Fueled by an adrenaline she had never known, she scrambled across the floor, her fingers stretching. reaching. Her hand closed around the wooden grip of the pistol. It was heavier than she could have ever imagined. A solid, dense weight of cold steel and unforgiving purpose. It felt alien in her hand, a thing of terrifying power. She had never held a gun in her life. She fumbled with it, her fingers clumsy, her thumb searching for the hammer. Cobb, seeing what was happening, shouted a warning. "Boss, the gun!" Halter spun around, his face a mask of disbelief that quickly curdled into fury. He raised his knife and lunged. June didn't have time to think. She didn't have time to aim in any traditional sense. She simply reacted. She pushed herself up to a sitting position, bringing the heavy gun up with both hands, the barrel shaking wildly. She saw the massive shape of Halter coming at her, filling her vision. She pulled the trigger. The explosion was a physical blow. It was a sound so immense it had no echo, a roar that slammed into her, stole her breath, and left a ringing silence in its wake. The recoil kicked the gun up violently, wrenching her wrists. Acrid, blue-gray smoke filled the air, burning her nostrils and making her eyes water. Halter stopped. He stood perfectly still for one long, impossible second. A look of profound, almost comical surprise washed over his face. He looked down at his own shoulder, where a dark, round hole had suddenly appeared in his coat, a hole that was already blossoming with a stain of crimson. The knife fell from his nerveless fingers, clattering to the floor. "You!" he gasped, the word a wet, incredulous croak. Then his knees buckled. He collapsed, not forward, not backward, but straight down, as if his strings had been cut. He landed in a heavy, graceless heap, a wounded bull brought down by a stray hornet. A raw, animal scream of pain and rage tore from his throat. June stared. The gun still held out in front of her, her arms trembling violently from the strain and the shock. The ringing in her ears was a high, thin shriek. Cobb, his face a mask of shock and terror, looked from his fallen boss to the smoking gun in her hands and made his decision. He was a jackal, not a wolf. He had no loyalty to a wounded leader. He scrambled for the broken door, half falling out onto the porch and disappearing from sight. The last June heard of him was the frantic sound of him untying the horses, a desperate scramble to flee. The cabin was suddenly, profoundly silent, except for Halter's ragged, pained moans and the high-pitched ringing in June's ears. She looked at the gun in her hands. It was a terrible, powerful thing. She had used it. She had shot a man. The gun fell from her numb fingers, clattering onto the floor beside the knife. It was just a piece of metal again. The magic and the horror was gone. The wave of rage and adrenaline drained away as quickly as it had come, leaving her utterly empty. A hollow shell, and into that emptiness, a single, overwhelming reality rushed back in. "Jed!" She scrambled to his side, her knees protesting, her hands shaking so badly she could barely see. She fell to the floor beside him, her hands hovering over his still form, afraid to touch him, afraid of what she would find. "Jed!" she whispered, her voice a cracked, broken thing. There was no response. His face was slack, his skin a pale, waxy color beneath the blood. His chest was still, too still. Panic, cold and absolute, seized her. It was a terror far worse than anything she had felt from Halter. This was not the fear of what a man could do to her, but the fear of what the world had done to him. She put a trembling hand on his chest, feeling for a heartbeat, for a breath, for anything. For a horrifying second, there was nothing. Then, she felt it. A faint, slow, stubborn thump. And another. He was alive. A sound tore from her throat. A sound she had never made before. It was not a cry, or a scream, or a sob. It was all of them at once. A raw, ragged eruption of every ounce of fear, and horror, and grief, and a desperate, burgeoning love she hadn't even had a name for until this very moment. She leaned over him, her tears falling onto his blood-stained face. her hands clutching the rough fabric of his shirt. "Jed!" she screamed, the name a raw, ragged tear in the new silence. The first and only word in a world that had been completely unmade and remade in the space of a single heartbeat. "Jed, wake up, please!" The echo of the gunshot faded, leaving behind a silence so profound it was a physical weight. It pressed down on June, filled her ears, and suffocated the air. In the center of that silence lay the wreckage of her world, one man dead, another groaning and bleeding, and the man who was her anchor lay broken and still by the hearth. For a long, suspended moment, she was frozen, a statue carved from shock. Her scream for Jed had torn the last of her strength from her, leaving her a hollow, trembling vessel. Then, from the dark square of the cellar, a small sound, a whimper. "Tom." The sound was a needle that pierced the thick blanket of her paralysis. It was a call to a duty that superseded her own terror. She could not fall apart, not now. The boy was still down there, in the dark, listening to the aftermath of a war he could not understand. Pushing herself up on shaky legs, June moved with the jerky, unnatural steps of a marionette. She avoided looking at Halter, who was now trying to push himself up, his face a mask of white-hot agony. She gave the dead man a wide berth. Her entire focus narrowed to 2 points of purpose, the child in the cellar and the man by the hearth. She knelt by the trapdoor. "Tom," she whispered, her voice a raw, unfamiliar croak. "It's me. It's June. It's over now. You can come out." There was no response, only a terrified silence. "Tom, please, I need you to be brave. I need you to climb the ladder." A small, shuffling sound, and then his head appeared, his eyes huge and dark in his pale face. He stared at the scene, at the blood and the bodies, and his lower lip began to tremble. June reached down and put her hands under his arms, lifting him out as if he weighed nothing. She immediately turned him away from the worst of the carnage, shielding his face against her body. "Don't look," she murmured into his hair. "We're going to the barn. You'll be safe in the barn." She led him, stumbling, through the broken door and out into the gray, indifferent twilight. The world outside was so calm, so untouched by the violence within the cabin. It felt like a betrayal. The horses Halter and his men had ridden were still tied to the rail, their ears twitching nervously. She didn't look at them. In the warm, sweet-smelling darkness of the barn, she found an empty stall filled with clean hay. She sat Tom down, wrapping an old horse blanket around his small, shaking shoulders. "Stay here," she commanded, her voice gaining a thin thread of authority she didn't know she possessed. "Do not leave this stall. I have to go back. I have to help Jed." The boy just nodded, his eyes fixed on her face with a desperate, silent plea. Leaving him there was the hardest thing she had ever done. Every step back toward the cabin was a battle against the instinct to run, to grab the boy and disappear into the wilderness. But she could not leave Jed. When she re-entered the cabin, Halter had managed to drag himself a few feet toward the door, leaving a thick, glistening trail of blood behind him. He was breathing in ragged, wet gasps. He looked up at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of hatred and a dawning, animal fear. He was no longer a predator. He was just a wounded beast, cornered and dying. For a moment, she thought he might try to speak, but only a gurgle came out. She turned away from him, her heart a cold, hard stone in her chest. Her first task was a grim, brutal necessity. She could not tend to Jed in a room full of his enemies. With a strength born of pure, desperate will, she grabbed the dead man by his boots and dragged him, his body a dead, clumsy weight, out of the cabin and onto the porch. She did the same with Halter, who was now barely conscious. She couldn't look at their faces. They were just objects now. Terrible, heavy things that had to be moved. She left them on the porch, a grotesque tableau for the coming night. Then, she was alone with Jed. Getting him to the bed was an impossible, Herculean labor. He was a large man, all lean muscle and solid bone, and she was a slip of a girl, her strength already spent. She tried to lift him by his arms, but he was too heavy. She sobbed in frustration, her tears hot on her cheeks. Finally, she managed to get his arms over her shoulders, and by half lifting, half dragging, she moved him, inch by agonizing inch, across the floor. His head lolled against her, his breathing a shallow, frightening rasp. By the time she got him onto the bed, she was drenched in sweat, her muscles screaming in protest. She collapsed onto the floor beside him, her chest heaving, her vision swimming with black spots. He was alive. He was in the bed. That was the first victory. The next few days blurred into a single, unending night, a twilight world measured only by the changing of bandages and the level of water in the bucket. Jed did not wake. He was lost somewhere deep inside himself, adrift on a dark, feverish sea. The gash on his temple was deep, and his skin was hot to the touch, a dry, burning heat that terrified her. June became his keeper, his guardian. Her own fear, her own trauma, was packed away into a small, tight box in the back of her mind. There was no time for it. Jed needed her. She became a creature of ritual. At dawn, she would check on Tom in the barn, bringing him a piece of bread or a cold biscuit. The boy had found a litter of kittens in the hayloft and had become their fierce, silent protector, a responsibility that seemed to anchor him. He would follow her back to the cabin and sit on the porch, a small, quiet sentinel, while she worked inside. She tore one of the cabin's few clean sheets into strips for bandages. She had seen Jed use whiskey to clean a horse's wound once, and with trembling hands, she did the same for him, cleaning the cut on his head as gently as she could. He flinched in his unconsciousness, a low moan escaping his lips, and she had to bite her own lip to keep from crying out. She bathed his face and body with cool water, trying to fight the fever that consumed him. She brewed thin broths from the last of the salted venison and spent hours by his bedside, trying to spoon a few precious drops between his cracked, dry lips. Most of it ran down his chin, but some of it, she prayed, went down. She talked to him. She filled the heavy silence of the cabin with a constant, low murmur. She told him about her day, about Tom and the kittens, about the way the light looked on the prairie in the morning. She told him stories from her childhood, small, forgotten memories of her mother, of a life before the saloons and the fear. She didn't know if he could hear her, but she couldn't bear the silence. The silence felt too much like death. The cabin, once his, became hers. She moved through the space with a sense of ownership born of desperation. She learned the specific creak of each floorboard, the way the fire needed to be banked just so to last through the night. She found his rifle, a heavy Winchester, and learned how to load it. The click of the cartridge sliding into the chamber, a small, reassuring sound of power in the deep, quiet nights. She took the bodies from the porch, dragging them a long way from the cabin, her face a grim, determined mask. She did what had to be done. She was no longer running. She was defending. She was holding the line. One night, the fever broke. She had been dozing in the chair beside his bed, her head resting on the edge of the mattress, when a change in his breathing woke her. The ragged, shallow gasps had been replaced by a deeper, more even rhythm. She placed a hand on his forehead. The burning heat was gone, replaced by a damp, blessed coolness. He was slick with sweat, but it was the sweat of a healing man, not a dying one. Relief, so powerful it made her dizzy, washed over her. She wept then, silent, shuddering sobs of pure, unadulterated gratitude, her face buried in the rough quilt that covered him. She must have fallen into a deeper sleep after that, her exhaustion finally claiming her. She was adrift in a dreamless, gray space when she felt it, a touch. It was faint at first, a slight pressure on her hand, which was resting on the bed beside his head. She thought it was part of a dream, but then it came again, stronger this time. Fingers, weak but definite, were closing around hers. Her eyes shot open. The cabin was dark, the only light coming from the glowing red embers in the hearth. Jed's head was turned toward her on the pillow. His eyes were closed, his face still pale in the dim light. But his hand, his large, calloused hand, was holding hers. She went completely still, her breath catching in her throat. His thumb moved, a slow, weak caress over her knuckles. His lips parted, and a sound, a rough, dry whisper, filled the small space between them. June! Hearing her name in his voice after so many days of silence was like a physical shock. Tears instantly filled her eyes. He was dreaming, caught in the fever mists between unconsciousness and the waking world. But even in that dark, lost place, he had found her. His grip tightened slightly, a fragile anchor in the night. "June," he whispered again, his voice thick with a deep, dream-soaked weariness. You don't have to run anymore." The words were not for him. They were for her, deep in the heart of his own battle. His thoughts had been of her safety, of her flight. He was telling her that the fight was over. The sanctuary was secure. The small, hard box in the back of her mind where she had packed away all her own pain and fears shattered. Everything she had held back, the terror of the chase, the horror of the fight, the grimness of the aftermath, the desperate, aching fear of losing him. It all came pouring out, not in a scream, but in a flood of silent, hot tears that streamed down her face, dripping from her chin onto their joined hands. She cried for the girl who had arrived here, half drowned and broken. She cried for the woman she had been forced to become, and she cried for the man who had given her a place to finally stop running, even at the cost of his own life. She brought his hand to her lips, pressing a kiss to his rough, dry knuckles. The tears continued to fall, but through them, a new feeling was rising, a feeling so pure and bright it felt like the sun rising in her soul. It was a smile, a wobbly, watery, tremulous smile that stretched her lips and made her eyes crinkle. It was a smile of impossible, profound relief. She leaned close, her lips near his ear, so her whisper would be the first thing he truly heard when he finally returned to the world. "I know," she breathed, her voice a mixture of a sob and a laugh. "I know. I'm home." Jed woke into a world of pain and silence. It was not the sudden, jarring return of a man waking from sleep, but a slow, arduous crawl from a deep, dark well. For 2 days after he first whispered her name, he drifted in and out of a gray, feverish fog. In his brief moments of lucidity, he would find her there, a constant, quiet presence by his bedside. He would see her face, pale and strained, her eyes large and dark with worry, and then the fog would roll in again, pulling him back under. June watched his slow return to the world with a heart that was a fragile, fluttering thing in her chest. Each time his eyes opened and recognized her, it was a victory. Each time he managed to swallow a spoonful of broth, it was a triumph. She and Tom had cleaned the cabin, scrubbing the floors until their knuckles were raw, trying to erase the physical stains of the violence. They had mended the broken door, patching it with planks from the barn. A clumsy but functional repair. They had rebuilt their world, board by board, while they waited for its protector to return to them. Slowly, Jed began to mend. The day he first sat up on his own, the room spinning around him, he had to lean on her for support, his hand gripping her shoulder with a surprising strength. The next day, he stood, his legs unsteady, and took 2 shaky steps before having to sit back down. June was his shadow, his cane, his unwavering support. A new language formed between them, one of a hand offered to help him stand, of a cool cloth pressed to his head, of a shared look that said, "We survived." The silence in the cabin was different now. It was no longer the comfortable quiet of 2 solitary people sharing a space. nor the tense, watchful silence after Cobb's visit. This was a silence of recovery, freighted with the weight of all that had happened. There were things that needed to be said, a chasm of violence and fear that lay between them, but they did not have the words for it. Not yet. So they spoke through action. She tended to him, and he, in turn, allowed himself to be tended to, a surrender of his stoic independence that was, for him, the ultimate act of trust. Nearly 2 weeks after the fight, the afternoon sun streamed through the window, warm and golden, painting stripes of light across the wooden floor. The world outside was vibrant with the last defiant colors of autumn. The prairie grass was the color of old gold, and the sky was a vast, benevolent blue. It was a day for living, for healing. Jed was out by the west fence line, the one that bordered the creek. The fight had not just broken his body, it had violated the sanctity of his land. And for a man like Jed, his land was an extension of himself. To mend the fence was to mend himself, to reestablish the boundaries of his world, to declare that this place was his, and it was safe. June watched him from the cabin door for a long time. He moved slowly, a slight stiffness in his gait betraying the deep ache in his ribs. The white bandage she had tied around his head that morning was a stark banner against his dark hair. He was not the same man he was before. He was thinner, and there were new lines of pain etched around his eyes. But as he worked, she saw the old, familiar rhythm returning, the steady, economic motion as he dug a new post hole, the focused set of his jaw as he tamped the earth down around the post. He was reclaiming his strength, one fence post at a time. A feeling swelled in her chest, so powerful it almost took her breath away. It was a complex, tangled thing, gratitude, admiration, a fierce, protective tenderness, and something more, something deeper and more frightening that she did not yet have a name for. It was the feeling of seeing a precious, broken thing slowly making itself whole again. She turned back into the cabin, took the wooden bucket, and filled it with cool, fresh water from the well. She took the gourd dipper from its hook and set it in the bucket. Her hands, as she did this, were not quite steady. She was about to cross a boundary of her own, to step out of the role of nurse and caretaker and into something new, something undefined and terrifyingly hopeful. She walked out to the fence line, her bare feet silent in the soft grass. The sun was warm on her back. The air was clean and smelled of dry earth and curing hay. Jed didn't seem to notice her until she was only a few feet away. He was stretching a length of wire, his back to her, the muscles in his shoulders and arms pulling taut under his flannel shirt.
Jed,
she said softly. He stopped, letting the wire go slack. He turned, his movements still careful. He looked at her, his face beaded with sweat, his expression neutral. But his eyes, when they met hers, were different. They held a new awareness, a watchfulness that was no longer about looking for threats on the horizon, but about seeing the person standing right in front of him. "I brought you some water," she said, her voice a little breathless. She held the bucket out to him. He came closer and reached for the gourd dipper. As he took it from her, his fingers brushed against hers. His skin was hot from the sun and rough with calluses. A startling, living warmth against the cool dampness of her own hand. A jolt, sharp and clean as a lightning strike, shot up her arm. It was a touch that carried the weight of everything that had happened between them, the fight, the fear, the long nights of vigil. He dipped the gourd into the bucket and drank deeply, the water running in rivulets down his chin and into the dark collar of his shirt. He let out a long, quiet sigh and handed the dipper back to her. His eyes, the color of a stormy sky, were fixed on her hand as she took it. "Your hands are cold," he said. It was a simple observation, a statement of fact, his voice its usual low, rough baritone. She looked down at their hands, his so large and brown against her own small, pale one. The air between them was suddenly thick, charged with all the words they hadn't said. She could have made an excuse, said it was the cool water or the breeze, but she was tired of hiding. She had faced down death in this man's home. She could surely face this. She lifted her gaze to meet his, her heart beating a slow, heavy rhythm against her ribs. "That's because," she began, her voice a near whisper, but clear and steady in the quiet afternoon. "I think the only thing that could warm them now is your hand." It was the bravest thing she had ever said. It was a confession, an invitation, and a plea, all wrapped in a few simple words. She was laying the last, most vulnerable piece of herself at his feet. Jed's expression did not change, but a muscle feathered in his jaw. He stared at her for a long, silent moment, and she could see the thoughts moving behind his eyes, a slow, deep turning of gears. He had been offered something, and a man like Jed did not take offerings lightly. He understood their cost. She thought he might turn away, retreat back into the safety of his silence. The thought was a cold knot of fear in her stomach. And so, before he could, she made another choice. She had taken his gun to defend his life. Now, she would take a different kind of risk to claim her own. Slowly, she leaned forward. She tilted her head, her eyes never leaving his, watching for any sign of rejection, of recoil. He remained perfectly still, a statue of sun-warmed granite. She rose up on her toes slightly and pressed her lips against his cheek. It was the first kiss of her life. It was nothing like the fumbled, drunken encounters she had witnessed and fled from in the saloon. There was no heat, no pressure, no demand. It was just a soft, hesitant touch, as light as a moth's wing. It was the taste of salt and sun on his skin, the rough rasp of his stubble against her lips. It was a kiss that held 1,000 unspeakable things: her gratitude for her life, her sorrow for his pain, her awe at his quiet strength, and the simple, terrifying truth that her world, which had once been a place to run from, had now shrunk to the space between the two of them. It was real. It was hers, and it was her gift to him. She pulled back, her face burning, her heart pounding so loud she was sure he could hear it. She waited for him to speak, to move, to do anything. Jed said nothing. He simply stood there, his eyes searching hers, a look of profound, stunned stillness on his face. Then, very slowly, he lifted his hand. It was the hand that had held a maul, a rein, a gun. It was the hand that had held hers in the dark of his fever. Now, it came to rest against her cheek, the one she had just kissed. His calloused palm was rough, but his touch was incredibly gentle. He did not pull her closer, nor did he push her away. He just held her, his thumb stroking softly against her skin. A silent, wondering gesture. The silence stretched, filled with the hum of insects and the sigh of the wind in the tall grass. When he finally spoke, his voice was a low, rough whisper, a sound that seemed to be scraped raw from the very depths of his soul. "No man owns your first night," he said, his words a gravelly, uneven tremor. He was looking at her, into her, seeing all the way down to the girl who had confessed her fears by his fireside. He took a breath, his gaze unwavering, his thumb still making slow, hypnotic circles on her cheek. "But if you choose to give it to me," he said, his voice dropping even lower, a vow spoken in the golden light of the setting sun, "I will guard it with my last breath." The words were not poetry. They were not a lover's pretty promise. They were rough, raw, and utterly real. They were the most beautiful thing she had ever heard. It was a promise of protection. But more than that, it was an affirmation of her choice. He was not taking. He was offering to be her guardian, her sanctuary, the keeper of a gift she alone had the power to give. Tears welled in her eyes, blurring his face into a watercolor of blue and gold. She did not bother to wipe them away. She just leaned into his hand. A silent, final surrender. Not to him, but to the home she had found in his keeping. The seasons turned. The raw, wounded green of summer bled into the burnished gold and deep, weary brown of autumn. The air grew crisp, carrying the sharp, clean scent of distant wood smoke and the sweet, earthy smell of dying leaves. The sky, once a canvas for violent storms and oppressive gray sheets, was now a high, vast, and achingly clear blue. It was a time of gathering in, of mending, of preparing for the long, quiet sleep of winter. On Jed's ranch, the healing of the land was a mirror for the healing of its people. The violent scars of the fight had begun to fade, absorbed back into the patient rhythms of the earth. The wildflowers, which had seemed to hold their breath in the tense days, now bloomed with a final, defiant burst of color along the fence line Jed had so carefully mended. Purple asters and goldenrod grew in thick, joyful clumps around the new pine posts, a testament to the fact that life, when tended and protected, would always find a way to reclaim its ground. The sound that best defined this new season was laughter. Tom's laughter. The boy, who had arrived as a solemn, silent shadow of Jed, had been reborn in the aftermath of the storm. The security of a complete, if unconventional, family had unlocked something inside him. His laughter was not a quiet chuckle. It was a loud, unrestrained, and utterly joyous thing that would erupt as he chased the barn kittens through the tall grass, or when June would make a funny face at him over the breakfast table. It was a sound that filled the quiet spaces, a melody of pure, uncomplicated happiness that echoed across the yard in the long, golden afternoons. It was the sound of a boy who finally felt safe. One bright, breezy afternoon, June took a basket of laundry out to the clothesline. In it, nestled amongst Jed's flannel shirts and Tom's small overalls, was a garment of plain, unadorned white cotton. It was a dress, simple in its cut with long sleeves and a high neck. It was a dress she had fashioned herself, working late into the nights by the firelight, painstakingly sewing the seams with small, neat stitches. She had taken one of the few good sheets they owned, bleached it in the sun until it was the color of fresh cream, and transformed it into a promise. She shook it out, the simple fabric catching the breeze and billowing like a sail. It was a wedding dress. It had no lace, no frills, no fancy adornments. It was as honest, sturdy, and unpretentious as the life she was choosing. As she pinned it to the line, the white cotton stark and beautiful against the deep blue of the sky, she felt a profound sense of peace settle over her. She was not the girl who had run through the rain, clutching the remnants of a life she was forced to protect. She was a woman hanging a symbol of her chosen future out in the open, for the sun and the sky and the whole world to see. It was an act of faith, a quiet declaration that the days of hiding were over. She was waiting for a peaceful day, a day not marked by the absence of fear, but by the presence of a deep and abiding joy. As she worked, she could hear the rhythmic, reassuring sound of a hammer coming from the cabin. Jed was fixing the door. He had taken down their clumsy, patched-up repair and was building a new one from scratch. He had found a thick, seasoned plank of pine in the barn, and the air was filled with its sharp, clean scent as he sawed and planed. He worked with the same slow, deliberate focus he applied to everything, his movements economical and precise. He was not just mending a broken entryway, he was performing a sacred ritual. This was the door that had been kicked in, the threshold that had been violated. It was the wound in the side of their home. As June watched him fit the new, strong planks together, she knew he was doing more than just building a door. He was building a wall. He was forging a shield. He was silently promising that this home, their home, would never be breached again. He was reinforcing it with new wood, with his own strength, with the quiet, unshakable force of his will. The sound of his hammer was a steady heartbeat, a rhythm of safety and permanence that resonated deep in her bones. Later, as the sun began to dip below the horizon, painting the sky in fiery strokes of orange and rose, the work was done. The new door hung proudly on its freshly oiled hinges. solid and secure. The scent of pine filled the air. Tom, exhausted from his day of play, was asleep inside, curled up with a kitten on the bearskin rug before the fire. A deep, comfortable quiet settled over the ranch. Jed was sitting on the top step of the porch, the one he had defended with a maul in his own body. He was cleaning a rifle, his large hands moving with a familiar, practiced grace over the steel and wood. June came out of the cabin, a quilt draped over her arm, and sat down beside him. She didn't speak, just settled next to him, the warmth of his body a welcome comfort in the cooling air. She draped the quilt over both their laps, a small, domestic gesture of sharing. For a long time they just sat, watching the last of the light fade from the sky and the first shy stars appear. The silence between them was no longer a space to be filled, but a thing to be shared, as rich and comfortable as the old quilt that covered them. It was a silence built from shared trials, unspoken understanding, and a trust that ran deeper than any words could ever express. Finally, June shifted, leaning into him, resting her head on the solid strength of his shoulder. It felt like coming home. It felt like the end of the longest, most difficult journey of her life. He stopped his work, his hands going still on the rifle, and allowed himself to take her weight, his own body relaxing into the quiet intimacy of the moment. He smelled of pine shavings, gun oil, and the crisp autumn air. He smelled of safety. She looked out at the vast, darkening prairie, at the fence line where the wildflowers bloomed, at the world that was no longer a threat, but simply a place where her life was. Her voice, when she spoke, was a soft, reflective whisper, a sound meant only for him.
The first day I came here,
she began, her cheek resting against the rough flannel of his shirt.
I asked to hide under your coat.
She felt the slight movement of his head as he nodded, a silent acknowledgement of the memory, of the half-drowned, terrified girl who had collapsed at his feet. She closed her eyes, a slow, peaceful smile touching her lips. The journey from that moment to this one was both a lifetime and the blink of an eye. She had been searching for a place, for walls, for a roof to keep her safe. She had been so wrong.
And now,
she whispered, the words a perfect, simple truth that resonated in the deepest part of her soul. I'm right here in your heart. Thank you so much for listening to our story. We'd love to know where in the world you're tuning in from, so please leave a comment below and let's share our thoughts. If you enjoyed this tale, please subscribe to our channel, Wild West Stories 1850, and give this video a like. To help this story reach more listeners, please also consider supporting us by hitting the hype button